Welcome everybody to Go Local Live. I'm Josh Fenton, CEO and co-founder. It is a special edition. The Vice President of the United States has named her running mate, her selection to be her VP. And we're running down to, she's in New York, Jennifer Lawless, the chair of the Political Science Department at the University of Virginia. Professor, thanks so much for joining us.
I'm happy to be here.
The Vice President makes a big pick. Not the pick that was the front runner as of just a day or two ago, who was Josh Shapiro. She has pivoted over to Tim Walz, the governor of Minnesota. Walk us through that selection.
It was not the expectation. Most people thought that he was the dark horse candidate who was just on the list because he had executive experience. But it turns out that Tim Walz is the person that Kamala Harris went with. And when you look at his resume and you look at his backgrounds and qualifications, it becomes clear why. He's somebody who has served in Congress, so he has experience having voted on foreign policy issues. He has a military background. He was a high school teacher. He's from Nebraska. He represents Minnesota. He has a relatively young family, and he's funny. And so all of these factors combined, I think, complement Harris and allow them together to look like an upbeat, forward-looking ticket compared to Trump and J.D. Vance, who look pretty sour and dour. So given his experience and his personality, it makes sense why she thinks that this is the best path forward.
So I saw some film footage of him earlier this morning. He looked slightly different. He was Richie Cunningham's dad. He, of course, was the father on Happy Days. I mean, is this really, this is the personification of middle America, middle-aged white guy?
Yes. And I think that I don't think that that's a bad thing coming from the Harris campaign. I think that they want to make it clear that they understand everybody that lives in this country. And it's no secret that she does not embody stereotypes or the reality of middle America. She resonates on the coasts. She resonates in urban areas. She doesn't necessarily resonate in the Rust Belt. She might not resonate in rural districts, even in blue states, and Tim Walz does. The other thing that I would note about him is that he has a very progressive record. And so he's one of these people who have managed to be a progressive. Organized labor, for example, loves him. He's managed to be progressive, but he's managed to do it in a way and with a style that seems pretty comfortable to people who live in flyover states.
Okay, so let's, what went wrong for Josh Shapiro? Was the reality of a Jewish governor, the first time a Jewish candidate would be on the presidential ticket, at a time in which we are literally awaiting rockets coming from Iran towards Israel with U.S. defense systems now in place, aircraft carriers rushing to the region in order to intercept missiles from Iran, southern Lebanon, Syria, and Yemen?
I don't know. I think there were several factors. The first, obviously, is that the foreign policy challenges and the war in Israel and Gaza are already a problem for the Democrats, and figuring out how to get out of that is tricky. People expect that the Biden administration and now Kamala Harris, if she wins, will be able to sort of end the war, and it's just not that simple. And so I do think that it's possible that with Shapiro on the ticket, it would have garnered more attention and more discussion and potentially more vitriolic statements than the Harris campaign would have wanted. But more than that, I think, are two things. First, if it's true that she wanted executive experience, and that's, for example, why Mark Kelly was taken out of the mix, Josh Shapiro has very little executive experience. And if she wanted foreign policy experience, Josh Shapiro has none. So there's no question that he won by a hefty margin in a battleground state that Democrats need to win if she's going to become the next president of the United States. But it's not clear that Josh Shapiro was the only vice presidential candidate that could help her win Pennsylvania. And it seemed that there were other experiences and assets that somebody like Tim Walz has that Josh Shapiro doesn't. The other thing is, there was, as the front runner, quite a lot of negative commentary coming in about Shapiro. And I don't think it helped that John Fetterman, the senator from Pennsylvania, said some very negative things about him. Democrats do not want this to be a J.D. Vance situation where more and more comes out over the course of the next few weeks than they expected. They certainly don't want there to seem like there's infighting within the party regarding her pick. And it seemed like we were moving in a direction where Josh Shapiro might generate some of that.
Listen, we'll never know about Walz until we know about Walz, but right now it is looking, shall I say, a little milquetoasty. There is a guy, Hillary Clinton picked a guy. It's hard to even remember the senator from Virginia's name.
Not for a Virginian.
Tim Kaine, who may be best remembered for, as a candidate for vice president, that he spoke Spanish, and then subsequent to that, not because of legislative accomplishments, because he has long COVID. So he was as milquetoasty a selection as you could possibly make. Made Dan Quayle look like a pop singer. So does the vice president run a risk by selecting Walz of having the ultimate milquetoast?
You know, it's funny because that was generally my impression of him. And when I was under the impression that he was going to, in fact, be named, my initial reaction was that this was a safe and a boring choice. Having read a little bit more about him, having watched some of the videos that he's made with his daughter as governor, trying to reach out to the people of Minnesota over, changes in seatbelt laws and texting while driving, for example, I don't think he's boring. He's actually quite funny. He's very, very affable. And he's wholesome in a way that's sort of like, that embodies a dad joke. That's not the same as milquetoast. I think he leans into it and he embraces it.
So he's more dad joke than milquetoast.
We like dad jokes lately.
Does this create a real problem for the Trump ticket? Because here's this guy, and I have seen a lot of interviews with him. He's clever, he's funny. He's the one who dubbed them weird first. Does he become, because he's not an attack dog per se, he's a punster more so. Does he become a real problem because it just makes Donald Trump look angrier and meaner?
Yes. And I think that, Kamala Harris has been running a campaign that is fun and uplifting and upbeat and forward-looking. And Tim Walz's personality and humor and manner of speaking are consistent with that kind of message and that kind of style. J.D. Vance and Donald Trump are the complete opposite of that. They're like the scowl twins. And that might not be a problem if you're running against a ticket that's also not particularly upbeat, happy, and enthusiastic. They've now got a situation where the juxtaposition is so real and so clear. The other thing is Harris and Walz have senses of humor. It's not clear that Trump and Vance do, which means that when they are side to side or when they are on a debate stage facing off against one another, they run the risk of seeming too negative, too dour, too backward looking, and basically too scary.
Okay, so what happens next? She's going to have him up on a stage some point today. Everyone, is going to dig into every video interview that he's ever had, including as a high school football coach. When he said something, they're going to dig into every aspect of his life. Is one of the problems that if anything comes up, there's 90-something days before Election Day?
Well, he's got a couple of things working in his favor. The first is that both Donald Trump and J.D. Vance, because of things that J.D. Vance has said, have now said that it doesn't matter who the vice presidential pick is, it's incidental and it's irrelevant. And so it makes it very difficult for them to attack him on those grounds. The second is that we've seen a vice presidential pick this cycle who has demonstrated that a lot of these things that come up from the past really don't matter to the base. And it's hard to imagine that that the Democrats or the Republicans are going to find anything that Tim Walz has said that is as troubling as some of the things that J.D. Vance has said. So that's not to say that, Tim Walz is inoculated from anything he may have said or any interview he'd given, because J.D. Vance has turned out to be far more of a wild card than people expected, but it is helpful. The other thing that I would say is over the course of the next, few weeks, and the next week in particular, as they traverse the battleground states, is we're going to see these candidates engage back to back. Now, obviously, both sides are going to be trying to mobilize their bases in these battleground states because turning out co-partisans is the best way to win that state. But you also have to win over some independents and swing voters in those states. And we're going to see what those messages are. It seems to me that Weird embodies a pretty upbeat, optimistic way of dismissing the opposition. That's
Okay.
positive. That's forward looking. That seems like a fresh idea. That's not the way that Donald Trump or J.D. Vance speak. And so we'll get a sense over the course of the next week with these back-to-back rallies as to which message resonates more.
You mentioned Tim Walz and the Democratic base. I don't think there are more than 5 Midwestern white guys in their early 60s. I'm not sure he's in exact alignment with that Democratic base. Isn't that a problem, though? Is that
organized labor is in love with Tim Walz?
Well, organized labor's head of the Teamsters appeared at the Republican convention and gave a resounding, upbeat, cheering message for only the second time, I believe, a Teamster president has appeared at the Republican convention, endorsement of Donald Trump. Not an endorsement, but de facto an endorsement.
And a lot has changed since then. The first is that Biden is not at the top of the ticket. The second is that Tim Walz was not one of the players. And the third thing I would note is that the entire convention, with the exception of Donald Trump, looked appalled by that speech, which was a speech that could have been given at a Democratic convention. And so when, labor has been speaking over the course of the last 2 weeks about Harris's pick, Walz was at the top of that list. And one of the ways that the Democrats win this election is making sure that in the Rust Belt and in union states, they energize the union membership, not just the union leadership. And so this helps. So the other thing I would note is that although he's from Nebraska and although he has won in conservative districts within Minnesota, his record is not particular, it's a progressive record. And so he might not look the progressive part the way that we stereotype what a progressive looks like these days, but when you look at his record, it's very, very difficult to find anything that's out of sync, not only with what mainstream Democrats favor, but also what the progressive wing of the party favors.
Well, and wasn't that a Josh Shapiro problem, which is with labor leaders in education? He had been in favor of education changes to allow, parents making selections and moving their money from public districts into other districts, and that's a no-no when it comes to the American Federation of Teachers and the NEA.
Right. I mean, supporting charter schools was among the issues that Josh Shapiro, and if he was picked, would have to explain. And that's not to, and some of Josh Shapiro's positions very well may account for the fact that he does have this 61% approval rating in a battleground state. He has taken positions that a lot of Democrats
that's a little bit of where I wanted you to come to.
Yeah, that doesn't help.
Which is the issue is that if you just be a regimented, progressive, pro-labor Democrat, you get to 47%. You don't get above 51%. And that Josh Shapiro has proven you can have progressive ideals, but you also have to have some other ideas, and those other ideas get you to, in a purple must-win Democratic state of Pennsylvania, get you to 61% approval rating, significantly higher than Senator John Fetterman's.
Well, that's true, except for 2 things. The first is he's not running for president of the United States. And so for every position where he differs with Kamala Harris, that then becomes a news story. She doesn't support charter schools. There are positions regarding, or at least the rhetoric they've used to describe what should happen with Israel and Gaza are not the same. The labor, obviously different positions. If he thinks that that's a strategy that can carry beyond Pennsylvania, then I think we're going to see it when he runs for president, either in 2028 or in 2032. But as VP, you don't want the main story every day to be the way that you and the president don't hold the same positions or the same values on a series of key issues. The second thing is the 61% approval rating is certainly real, but when he won the governor's race, he was up against a relatively weak opponent. And so although I have no reason not to believe the approval rating, I do think that the vote share was probably a reflection not only of his popularity, which it was, but also of the lack of popularity in his competitor.
Yeah, but his competitor was a true MAGA Trumpster. I mean, defined as one. So
Right. And so if you have somebody who seems moderate going against a real extremist, that person is going to do better than if you have somebody who's moderate on the left going against somebody who's moderate on the right. And that was not the contest that he ran.
Harris really needs Shapiro to buy in to this decision,
Yes.
I assume, and needs to stand there, big smile on his face, holding up her hand. Come on, Pennsylvania, vote for Harris. If not, the Democrats may be doomed.
Oh, I mean, there can be no indication of any sort of sour grapes. And frankly, it's not in Josh Shapiro's interest to indicate any sense of sour grapes because, first of all, he may want a cabinet position. Maybe he would like to be Attorney General of the United States. I don't know. Second, there's no way that this is not somebody who is going to run for president in the future. And you're judged by how well you handle not only your wins, but also your losses. And this is seen as, him not getting what he wanted. My sense is that he will be her biggest supporter in that state. He will rally that state. And if he's able to, if Pennsylvania goes Democratic, he'll be given credit for delivering that state, which positions him really well for the future.
Speaking of that issue of not handling defeats well, Nancy Pelosi in an interview said her near lifetime political friendship with Joe Biden may be in somewhat question. She has not heard from Joe Biden since his decision to leave the race. Clearly an indication that their relationship since her departure of supporting him in his re-election bid. What does that mean, and what does it mean to the Democratic Party, and what does it mean to Joe Biden's legacy?
I don't think it means anything for Joe Biden's legacy. Joe Biden has cemented his legacy, although there were 3 weeks where I think a lot of Democrats were nail biting and very, very upset and nervous about what would happen and questioning whether his legacy was going to be, thrown out. He got out. He did something that no person with that level of ambition we could imagine doing. He stepped aside, and then he just had this huge foreign policy win with bringing home these hostages. Joe Biden's legacy is solid. I think it's sad regarding their friendship and their relationship, but I also think it makes it clear that Nancy Pelosi is running things at the Democratic Party. I think there's no question that she's the one who's still making decisions. She's the one that still has the connections. She's the one that can make those phone calls. And she's the one who, in a very, very even-keeled tone, can become either a kingmaker or basically end your political career.
Okay, last question. We saw a big fluctuation on the stock market yesterday. It's rebounding a little bit, but obviously economic upheavals are always a potential threat. Whether Harris likes it or not, she is part of the incumbent party. Add into the mix a major potential foreign policy issue of Iran saying clear the airspace we're about to launch on Israel. What does the Biden-Harris administration need to do over the next few weeks to ensure that Trump cannot sort of take advantage of what the public may perceive as weaknesses, indecisiveness, lack of action?
Last night was a perfect example. I mean, over the course of the last 3.5 years, I don't remember there being much discussion about Harris being in the Situation Room with Biden. I'm sure she has been, but that hasn't been part of the messaging. Yesterday it was. And when there were discussions about why hasn't she made a pick? Why hasn't she named him? What's going on? Her response was literally in the Situation Room trying to figure out how we're going to handle the situation with Iran and Israel. And so as long as she's continuing to be seen as a leader on those issues, I think that's helpful. As far as the stock market is concerned, all I can say is the report from the beginning of August is better that it's in August than in September. And if the Fed lowers interest rates, that will be helpful. But this is kind of the last crummy report that they can withstand.
And with that, appreciate you taking the time joining us for this special report. Vice President Harris has selected Tim Walz, the governor of Minnesota, to be her running mate in the Democratic Party. How did you describe it? Not milquetoast, but
Dad jokes.
Dad jokes. Okay, we'll see. Everybody stay tuned for much more. It is rapid fire here at GoLocal, and we'll keep you up to date on everything in Rhode Island and the big stories around the country. Thanks, everyone.